I have to obey the government even when they pass laws that are contrary to God's Word? This is the question that we seek to answer today on the question and answer edition of Walking Through the Bible.
His word, the glory of His cross.
In today's discussion, we're not talking about whether or not we have to obey the government when they tell us to do something that is contrary to God's Word. The Scriptures clearly tell us that we have to obey God rather than men. In Acts 4:29 we read, "But Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men." If the government comes and tells us that we cannot preach the gospel anymore, we have to disobey the government. For God says that we have to preach the gospel to the whole world. If the government tells us that we can no longer preach against homosexuality, we would have to disobey the government. Because God says that homosexuality is a sin, and so if we want to be Christians, we would have to give up sin, meaning that it would have to be preached that homosexuality is a sin. But that is not what we're talking about today. What we're talking about is whether or not we have to obey the government because they pass laws that are contrary to God's Word. Some people refuse to pay their taxes because the government uses their taxes for evil purposes. Some governments use tax dollars to go to war, and there are some Christians who believe that all war is sinful. Whether or not this is true is a discussion for another time, but for now, all we have to know is that some view that action as sinful. Some governments spend tax dollars to fund abortion, something that the Bible does say is sinful. And so because the government does some sinful things with our tax money, some Christians believe that therefore we don't have to obey the government and pay our taxes, for in so doing, we would be supporting sinful things. It is really a misuse of Romans 1:32, which says, "Who knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them." Once we give our money to someone, what they do with it is no longer up to us. And so just because they use it for sinful things does not mean that we approve of their sinful things. Now, sure, on an individual level or even on a business level, we may decide later not to support that person or business, but the same thing does not apply to government. For the government is not the same as a private business or individual. A government is the minister of God. In Romans 13:1-7, Paul writes, "Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil." Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same, for he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Therefore, you must be subject not only because of wrath, but also for conscience' sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for they are God's ministers attending continually to this very thing. Render therefore to all their due, taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. When Paul wrote this letter to the Romans, the government of the day was the Roman government. This was the same government that was morally bankrupt, and it was a government that would persecute and kill Christians. Yet it was a government that Paul said that Christians had to obey. There are no caveats here saying that only if a government is righteous that you have to obey them and pay your taxes. Paul said you have to obey them and pay your taxes. That would also extend to obeying all the laws that don't go against God's laws, even when we disagree with those laws. If our government says that we have to get car insurance in order to drive a car, or any other type of insurance for that matter, we must obey the government if we want to drive a car. If the government says that between the ages of 5 and 18, a child must receive a secular education, then we must ensure our child receives that education. Sure, as parents, we must monitor what they are learning and teach our children what God teaches. But just because schools teach evolution in the science curriculum doesn't exempt us from providing our child an education. It just means we need to teach the child that evolution is wrong. Yes, governments will do things with our taxes that are sinful. And yes, governments will pass laws that either we don't agree with or are sinful themselves. But that doesn't give us the right to disobey government. Why? Because God ordained government and not man. And as such, governments are God's ministers. They will give an account for the things they did, just as we will give an account for the things that we do. In situations where the government isn't following after God's word, what can we do? We can follow after what Paul told Timothy in 1 Timothy 2:1-2, and pray for those in authority, that they may do right. But in all things, we must obey the government, where the government does not demand that we disobey God. Well, I know much more can be said on this topic, but our time is up for now. We hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Matthew 13, verses 36-43, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.
Of his cross.